All right, this is the fifth video lecture on the chapter of older adults. I want to wrap up this chapter talking about some social issues and practical issues and throw a few more terms out there at you. So the last lecture, we were talking about some of the theories, specifically about some theories about successful aging and what the research suggests helps people deal well or age well, quote unquote. And now in this chapter, I want to talk about what your textbook calls practical and social issues. So by this point in life, by the time we get to 75 years old, people are probably retired by now. Some of the trends about retirement is, so when Social Security was established back in the 1930s, it was not set up for people to live for, people were living maybe 5-10 years after they retired. And currently the way Social Security is, you retire at 62, you can begin retiring at 62, and we may be living for another 30 years, right? It really wasn't how it was intended. So one of the trends is that people live a whole lot longer past retirement than originally when the model was sort of set up. Some folks are choosing to work past their 65-year-old. Used to be, at one point in American history, it was mandatory that you retire by the age of 65. That has since been declared illegal. There are a couple occupations, I think one of them is airplane pilot, where you do have to retire by 65. So some folks experience ageism in the workforce. They're not given the same opportunities, or they're not hired because they're considered to be too old. In some cases, that may be associated with their cost a lot of money because they have more job experience, or they're going to cost a lot in terms of healthcare, or they're not going to be as productive. But what all the research says is actually the older worker has less absenteeism than the younger worker, despite the stereotype that they're going to have more because of their health. They may be a little bit slower, but they're more accurate, and often they have better attitudes. Some of the research. So I found a really interesting, what they call an infographic about the stereotypes about the older worker, and one of them was that they were hard to manage, unreliable, and those are all considered stereotypes. Retirement has different effects for men as opposed to women. Women appear to cope emotionally better with retirement because of the traditional gender socialization, where men are socialized and their identity is so wrapped up in their occupation that men may feel a loss of their personal identity that women don't necessarily feel, because women are more likely to have relationships with their children, ongoing relationships with their children. I did read a brief discussion that said that for men who had low morale at work, so basically men who were unhappy at work, that there may be what they call it, a honeymoon period when they retire, but that eventually wears off and then they don't fare quite as well. Financial issues, women usually don't do quite as well in retirement, partly because they've worked at a lower wage job throughout their work days. They're going to live longer, so they need more money. Their money's not going to stretch quite as far. And they probably have worked fewer years than men, because women are probably spending more time in childcare, taking care of the kids. So they don't work as many years, they need more money, and they're not paid as much when they ultimately do work. But it is worth pointing out that the current group of retirees, the baby boomers, are actually the most financially well-off retirement generation in American history. They're the richest old people ever. And that is thought to be because they had their whole working career, they were investing in Social Security, right? Because of when Social Security became the law, and because through the 1980s, the stock market grew so much. So they are some of the wealthiest retirees. There's a term here called aging in place, and there's a lot of emphasis these days in gerontology and geriatrics to support aging in place. And that is, it's a fancy way of saying that you age in your home, that you don't move out, right? You stay in your house, independent living. There is a trend for actually this is a recent trend, older living with your adult children. Of course, the quality of these relationships depends on the quality, like how well you got along before you move your mother in. I have lived with my mother has lived with us twice, and in both cases it was fine. The research does suggest though that older people don't really want to live with their children. I don't know. I haven't read much about that. Assisted living is a fancy term for those retirement facilities. Like I know what they're called in Manhattan, but so like there's a really high dollar one and they're expensive, and you gradually move from like an independent duplex into an apartment into a nursing home. And they're really great facilities, but they're quite expensive, and moderate and low income people simply don't have that option. The older you get, the more likely you are to live in a nursing home. My mother says she wants to live in a nursing home. And it's not at all uncommon for somebody to start to live with their adult children. And when their adult children can't take care of them anymore, or in some cases, the caregiving inhibits the child's, the people's ability to have a relationship. So they move their elderly family member into a nursing home so that they can be their daughter again. So it would be like, my mom could live with me as long as she can mostly take care of herself. But once I have to start, wiping her butt, now she's, now I'm really not her daughter. I've become her caregiver and her nurse. And that can put a great strain on relationships. And so here's a couple theories as to how relationships change later in life. You have something called the social convoy theory. I had never heard this theory before. I read it in your book. But what this theory says is that older people have identified they've identified helpers in their network. And so they rely on them. They figured out who in their social network they can turn to for support. So they may not have children or necessarily, friends, but maybe there's a lady at church or something like that. And then then we've already talked about this one. I thought we talked about it twice. That's the socio-emotional selectivity theory, which says that the network of folks that older people have in their life gets smaller and smaller as they age, but that's because they're more selective. So they're selecting people, they're limiting who they interact with based on they're emotionally selective, right? We've already talked about that. Okay, what happens to marriages in older adults? Well, older people are way less likely to get divorced. Chances are they may have actually been divorced, maybe a second or a third marriage. People who are married actually live longer and are healthier. This is more true for men than it is for women. What often happens is for women, because remember, going back to the very beginning of the chapter, and we were talking about life expectancy, and men's life expectancy right out of the gate is about 7 years shorter than women. That since men's lives are shorter, they're more likely to need health care, to need intimate personal care, and their wives are more likely to be the ones doing that. So this begins to put a strain, and it can create, so men may live longer and live healthier lives and may be more satisfied at the end of their marital relationships, but not so much women. Women may actually, that marriage may actually be costing them emotionally, physically, as they care for their aging and sick husband. Obviously, widowhood then is more likely for women. So you have the widows and the widowers, and widowers are men and widows are women. And you go to a nursing home and chances are pretty good you're going to find, I think the statistic is odd, is like something 7 or 8 men. I know it's 5 men to every one woman in a nursing home, because women just outlive men at that particular rate. This is just a sort of a summary list, if you will, of all the other relationships that are discussed in your textbooks. Folks who have never been married are less lonely at the end of their life than folks who have been married. The group that is least likely to be married actually are Black women. I don't know if I've mentioned it in a previous chapter or not, but one of the books on my bookshelf is called Is Marriage for White People? And the thesis, he basically says, yeah, the white folk marry a whole lot more than than black women. Black women are actually the least likely of any demographic group to get married. So that means the end of life, they're also the least likely to be lonely, right? About 9 out of 10 cohabitating older people were previously married. My mom has cohabitated with 2 men. The man that she's currently cohabitating with was actually married like 5 times. She would be like his 6th wife or something. There's very little data on lesbian and gay couples, on LGBT couples. One reason for that is that this is, they've only been, Supreme Court only said that that same-sex couples could get married, I don't know, was it 2017, 2015, not very long ago. So there is simply no data available. And the older couples, the older homosexual couples today would have come of age during an era where you didn't talk about it. You didn't talk about the being a couple. So that'll be something that the data will still be out. Adult children, this again depends on your relationship. Often it's a reflection of your childhood relationship. There's something called it's a mutual aid relationship, which is simply where the adult child receives aid from the elderly mother or the elderly parents, and the elderly parents receive aid from the adult child. This is more common between mother and daughter than it is between any other combination. Fathers just don't ask for help. And it's more common for daughters to help fathers. I had an elderly next door neighbor who would say to me, that, well, I had 3 sons. And that was his excuse for why he had to hire people to help him, because if he had a daughter, he would have asked his daughter for help, but you don't ask your son for help, was what his logic was. It's also significant relationships, what happens to siblings, amongst siblings. The research suggests that they begin to overcome their grievances, that even if they didn't get along as kids, they will still be supportive, but this is also mostly true for sisters. And then finally, a brief discussion about great-grandchildren. And this woman here is a whole bunch of images of her out in the internet. She is 100, I think it's 100 years old, and I think she has 88 great-grandchildren. Is why I stuck that picture in. And obviously they're not, great-grandparents are not as involved with their grandchildren, with their great-grands, as they were with their grandchildren. But this wraps up the chapter on older adults. The last topic will be death and dying. Thank you for listening.